Oh,
Greetings, how are you?
not too bad. How are you?
Doing all right. Doing all right.
Good. Good to hear.
So, you've reverted to your Marfan syndrome.
Now you've got me. Marfan syndrome. What have I done?
Oh, that's the genetic disorder with which Abraham Lincoln was afflicted.
Oh, well, I myself have a number of genetic disorders, and so I feel that kind of kinship with Honest Abe.
Well, yeah, I think you have a pretty thriving support group going. I mean, there's not very many of them, and seeing as how the only honest work they can find is as Abraham Lincoln impersonators, they need all the help they can get.
Yeah, well, I've tried to stage the assassination several times, but I can never manage to fire the gun at the back of my own head in just the right way. So I've got mixed feelings about Abe Lincoln's life now, but yeah, you know.
Well, that's a terrible shame. Because the entry and exit wound would be a fine thing to see, a great historical curiosity.
Well, you can do it with JFK provided you have access to the so-called hyperdimensional plane. I mean, if you can shoot yourself from multiple angles, multiple times, and simultaneously have all the shots come from behind, well, then that's like that's a real magic trick. That's like the three-dimensional chess in Star Trek. The whole thing takes place on multiple levels.
Well, when humanity gains access to that sort of technology, I wouldn't be surprised if there are people who endeavor to do so. It's unfortunate that we're cut off from the art of suicide. I imagine that there's more creativity that goes into people's self-inflicted demise than we're often led to believe.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I think there's a real artistry to it that's lost. I mean, there are people who commit suicide in ingenious ways. People who commit suicide to avoid discovery. To avoid it being coming known that they committed suicide. They'll do it in particular ways that probably would astonish people if they learned about it later.
Yeah, I am. I saw one of those so-called human interest stories pop up on Yahoo recently, where an American man faked his own death in a gruesome car crash in the middle of the street in front of his girlfriend, so that he could stand up and say, "Well, now you see how much you care about me. Will you marry me?" And she said yes.
Yeah, I saw that story too. That's good. Yeah, I think that human performance art is evolving in much the same way that the capacity of the individual for massive destruction, a la terrorism, is evolving and improving over time. I think the individual capacity for things like performance art and crazy practical jokes is also improving. It's one of those unreported on stories.
Hmm. There are some stories that to report on would be contrary to the interest of the media and the establishment in general. So, unfortunately, we're sort of systemically barred from exposure.
Yeah, I've noticed that myself. Any story that would suggest that the individual is empowered in particular ways, the story just it's always suppressed. It's never really reported on. Of course, you're empowered to pay your bills and to rescue other people during natural disasters, et cetera, et cetera. But you're not really empowered to do things that might change the basic conditions of society. Anybody who might be guilty of that, forget about it. You're never going to hear about it in the news.
Well, then it's interesting because I think that the news is predisposed to showing instances of human folly or random misfortune, and only instances of altruism that fall within, that are reinforcing uh, the existing system. And that's it. And not only that, but the news coverage, more often than not, you get the middle of a story, but not its beginning. And if it's not sufficiently sensational, you don't get the end of the story. So there's this perpetual arising, but not falling away, no resolution. 90% of the things that are brought to your attention on the news have no context and they don't go anywhere. So it feeds a pervasive disorientation, and that in turn can generate a kind of apathy, ignorance, and confusion that's really conducive to the status quo.
Well, that's true. It's especially true. If you look at the central role that the news, quote unquote, plays, I think you could probably pretty effectively divide societies into news societies and non-news societies. I mean, if you look at the way that the news functions as an oral tradition in the US and in other countries, obeying that particular dynamic, you have people who are in a constant state of amnesia, they're disoriented, they're distrustful of their neighbors. You look at the Halloween phenomenon in the US over the past 20 or 30 years. There obviously once was a time when you could knock on your neighbor's doors without too much of a second thought for the purpose of obtaining candy and a reaction to your costume, right? Well, today, because of the phantasmagoria of, child molesters and serial killers, all of your neighbors belonging to those categories, forget about it. I mean, only in places lost to time do you really have any kind of trick or treating. So you've got the distrust because everyone around you is a criminal or a threat. Then you've got the more general folly, as you call it, which on one level, when it has to do with powerless people, reinforces the idea that human beings in their natural state are stupid. But then when it comes to politicians and political figures, the idea that they are all simply stupid and corrupt serves a useful function in that it discourages any kind of belief in political conspiracies because, oh no, they're too stupid. No, they can't keep a secret. It's like the congressional vision people have. They think the government as a whole is identical to what they know about their congressmen and, how stupid they are and their picadillos. Whereas government as a whole, has a lot of different wings and a lot of different natures.
Yeah, it's an amorphous beast. Oh, gee, I was very well acquainted with somebody who was teaching in Harlem public elementary school for a while, and I was graced with some of the stories of the proceedings on Halloween. Apparently, instead of throwing eggs off the rooftop, they throw box cutters.
Yeah.
And let's see if I can remember. Oh, darn, somehow it slipped my mind. The story of the kid who hadn't seen his mother in a couple weeks and told the teacher, "Oh, well, I saw my mom the other day, and I was really happy because, well, I'm living with my grandmother, and it was really good to see her." And the teacher's like, "Really? Where?" "Well, she was strung out on crack and lying in the street." Somehow that's usurping my attention from recalling the rest of the details about Halloween. That's an endemic phenomenon up there. Or I say up there as if I'm still sitting in New York. It's an endemic phenomenon where people in that community hand their kids off to the grandparents for whatever reason, and you have this tide of grandparents who have 10 or 20 grandchildren, but no children.
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah, it's a funny world we live in.
Well, my view has always been that Rome is falling everywhere, always, and a lot of it's just a question of relative degree. You find this shit going on in all periods, in all cultures, but to greater and lesser extents, and sometimes for different reasons. But the kind of vivid varieties you get today, they're really entertaining when you look at them from a particular point of view. Because human beings, they do improve, they evolve, they adapt. I mean, you look at the Olympic scores, right? It's a steady improvement in the times for the 100-meter dash. Humans do improve. So somebody one year throws eggs off the roof of a building. Well, guess what? You know, 10 years later, the next generation, somebody comes up with a better idea. Let's throw box cutters. Yeah, it's an improvement. You see the same thing in porn. I mean, porn evolves almost according to purely mathematical laws and rules of geometric combination. I mean, how many bodies can you arrange? In what patterns can you arrange the bodies? What can go into what holes? It's totally mathematical. It's algebraic when you look at the way it evolves. And of course, shit is forgotten and rediscovered. You see the murals, left behind in Pompeii with all the different rooms of the brothel dedicated to different sex acts. And of course, hundreds of years, thousands of years of Christian piety caused a lot of that to be forgotten or at least really suppressed. Today, you've got a high-tech explosion of it. I mean, any kind of porn you want. I mean, look at the furries, for God's sakes. People dress up in giant furry animal costumes. I mean, what the fuck?
Are you familiar with tentacle porn?
Cannibal porn?
Tentacle.
Tentacle porn.
That's right.
I know of it only from like anime or whatever, Japanese animated porn.
Well, yeah, I believe just about anything that you could imagine, there are people who have an active interest in it. I once stumbled across, I don't know whether it was produced for anthropological purposes or what, but there was this elaborate map of every conceivable human fetishistic activity. And the furries are the tip of the iceberg. I mean, we've got people who are attracted to furniture, to trees.
Furniture. Furniture?
That's right. People who have an erotic experience from driving their own car. Any number of, well, at the very least, perhaps it's a kind of evolutionary pressure dissuading certain individuals from reproducing.
Well, we might hope, but I'm not too sure about that. It's become merged with the idea of lifestyle. So you can be a married father of three, and then on the weekends you go to the Hilton Hotel for your furry convention, and your genes are propagating just fine. There was a recent story out about some scientists who now claim that the geographical location where the Indo-European languages began is actually in Turkey. I guess for a long time it's been thought that these languages all came from original ancestor, which was up in kind of like the steppes of the Ukraine, up in that area. But now, based on looking at the patterns according to which infectious disease spreads, they've backtracked and they come up with a map of Turkey, the location of Turkey as being where on the map this whole family of languages began. Well, I think you could do the same thing with all of these sexual patterns. I mean, I think you could map the development of all the motifs. They proceed according to rules of transformation. Like it's always step by step by step. And I think it's sort of like the spread of infectious disease, where to get from point A to point C, you have to go through point B. And it'd be interesting to show that mathematically.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if it could be done. It's fascinating how you can have a self-organizing system that's running, you know, quite despite the conscious participation of any given individual who's a part of it. Because I'm certain that the lady who volunteered to have 1,300 different men come along and spray their semen in her face over the course of 2 days with no sleep was not aware of herself as participating in this strictly mathematical progression.
No, no. I mean, it's the old Lacanian point about sexuality, human sexuality, already being and belonging to the so-called symbolic order, the order of linguistic expression, mathematical expression. It's all, there's no such thing as a natural, innate sexual instinct that isn't always already mediated by these symbolic forms. So, when you have these competitions between porn stars for who can get schlonged by the highest number of dudes in a single session, and then they have these competing videos come out. Because I heard of the Houston 650 or whatever, but now you're telling me they're up to 1,300. So if they're up to 1,300,
Well, in this case, I don't. She didn't have intercourse with them. They just encircled her and masturbated and spread their material on the surface of her body.
well, then that's slightly different because in the Houston 620 or 650, Houston was on like a circular cafe table, and she had like 600 dudes come up, pump her real fast, blast one off, and they would come in like groups of five. So they'd be like, the first batting crew would be up, and then the second batting crew. So they had the whole system going. But I know for a fact that prior to the Houston event, there was somebody else who had a lower number. Now, I think it's fair to say that there's qualitatively no difference between a porn video with like 400 dudes doing it and 600. There's no real difference. So what is the only difference? It's totally mathematical.
But well, I don't. I wonder whether we can give an equally neat mathematical expression for the existence of things like adult babies, people who want sexually desire plush animals, um, people who let's see, uh, people who wish to become a balloon. Apparently, that's a common.
To become a balloon,
That's right. If
what
you
the fuck is the point of that?
well, imagine that a woman places her mouth on your genitals and continues the blowing motion. They want to inflate and float away.
Oh, well, there you go. So there's like a topological bridge between the two,
That's
you
correct.
know? Yeah. So there you go. Yeah, I think you can. I think if you know all the steps in between, it can be done. Just like in the early days of philology, you'd have one word that's so distantly related to another word that there's no apparent relationship in the beginning, but over time, when you build up all of the relationships and you know what the cognates are and so on, you can say, this root underwent these transformations to arrive here.
I see. Well, I wonder what's actually more fascinating, the mathematical progression or the phenomenology of the woman who, the moment of transition in someone's mind where they move from boredom and basic dissatisfaction to I have a hamster. That hamster will move on any surface it's placed on because it's always trying to go somewhere. I,
Let me put it in my ass. Give me that hamster.
that's right.
This
Um,
is natural human ingenuity at work. I mean, I think this is the one thing that is universal in human beings is this kind of ingenuity that is utterly ridiculous and useless and goes on underneath, behind the scenes.
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of human ingenuity goes into things that really serve no purpose. I mean, on a more positive side, I mean, if you, I'm told by people who show up at the Tolkien conventions that practically everyone there has invented their own language. Now, just consider the amount of human ingenuity that would have to go into the act of inventing your own language with a system of rules and with a robust vocabulary. And there are all these people, apparently thousands of them, enough to fill a convention hall, who have a language that only they can speak. Um, and then, when you consider the whole panoply of people who build unusual objects in their backyard and who engage in some, you know, practically solipsistic, self-directed endeavor, there's all this uh, creative force that's kind of being dissipated like entropy. Because biologists account for the fact, sometimes people raise the argument that life violates the second law of thermodynamics, because life, as it evolves, is becoming progressively more complex. But they say that a living organism gives off more noise, more entropy, in the form of body heat and excrement than they can ever produce in terms of their tangible uh, output of their purposive activity. And creativity seems similar in a way, because there's all this psychic energy being lost in people dressing up like the Easter Bunny to have sex with an 18-year-old wearing 2 foot tall heels, um, and so on and so forth.
Well, all of these fuckers who go to the conventions and dress up, I hate them. I hate them. I I'm so appalled by the state of geek culture today. When my old man was growing up in those days, geeks were people who had intelligence and knowledge, and generally that was why they were scorned. So in the classic, days of the 1950s, for example, you had your jocks aspiring to their own ideal of manhood, which contained very little of intelligence, and of course you had the women aspiring to the ideal of beauty and womanhood. So it was all about mating and breeding. And if you fell outside of the matrix of mating and breeding, uh, you would be called, quote unquote, a geek or thought of as a geek. But those geeks, in order to survive, probably allow themselves to develop individually in the direction of science, a lot of them, and knowledge. I mean, the old image of the like a pencil neck geek with like the pocket protector, right? The guy who was great at math, the guy who was great at science, all that kind of stuff. So you had the understandable bifurcation into people who could only aspire to cartoonish manhood and cartoonish womanhood. And then outside of that simple matrix, you had people who probably, in order to find their own place, applied actual intelligence, developed their own intelligence, and then acquired expertise. I mean, my old man back in the day, he uh, he went into radios. He did everything with radio, built his own radios, did the whole ham radio thing, worked for a radio station, and then at another point went to work for a chemical company where by the time he retired, he was doing advanced work called chromatography, and they had to replace him with like a PhD and two people who had master's degrees. Now, he had no college degree, but he had natural intelligence and he applied himself in that direction. What do I see from my perspective in contrast today? It's just entertainment culture, entertainment subcultures. These people who are geeks and who ought to be smart, they're total morons. I mean, you've run into them on the internet all the time. You know, you try to talk to them. They're just like sneering, pale, weak people who, like the comic book guy from The Simpsons. You know, he tries to speak in an intelligent way, but he obviously is a moron, and they predominate. So you're like, well, what the hell happened to the old geek culture? You know, kids playing with science sets in the 50s and doing all sorts of wild shit like that. Well, now they're co-opted by capitalism. So if you have any kind of aptitude at a certain age, you're fast-tracked through the academic system to hit a university and immediately go into some sort of, you know, corporate underworld. And so there's no actual geek culture that surrounds expertise. Instead, it's all just this fatuous geek entertainment culture where, oh, here we've got our Lord of the Ring fans, and here are our Twilight fans, and these people dress up, and you know, blah blah blah. Just little empty exercises in anthropology. Oh, I can't stand it. Disappoints the hell out of me.
Well, yeah, I have to say that on the whole it is disappointing. I think that a good portion of it can be accounted for the fact that the geek has become a kind of cultural idea. The geek has become the object of sexual infatuation, and a geek now is the cliched handsome man or beautiful woman behind a pair of dark horn-rimmed glasses who is practically waiting to be revealed. Or the geek is the Williamsburg hipster who can fix your you know, your your iPad, which of course is, you know, there's no ingenuity there. Every component of it is owned by the same company, and you know, made to be as streamlined and easy to understand and master as possible.
Well, I can see that there is some overlap between today's hipster model and the older, you know, more all-purpose geek model. And we shouldn't fail to mention the fact that there are computer geeks, like you imply. I mean, there are computer hackers, people who spend all their time actually doing something like programming. Of course, they're not really paragons of intelligence in general. I mean, if you look at the anonymous group and its politics, I mean, what could be a more obvious example? Here's a group with, at the moment, some actual power. They can do things to other people's computers. What are the politics? It's totally juvenile. Oh, we hate Scientology because they're all assholes or they're bad, but we have no other real political beliefs, and that's the extent of it. So, eh.
Well, yeah, they're a wasted possibility. You know, I feel like this is something that I observed in the course of time I was hanging around Occupy Wall Street. There seems to be such a disenchantment with structure, with institutions, that people laud the absence of structure. If you talk to people, people are practically happy that there are no goals and there is no leader. But if you try to say to people, well, you know, you're not going to be able to hold on to this park forever, they'd say, yes, we will. Well, I mean, in the worst case, I don't want to make a cartoonish parody of people who, on the whole, were driven and intelligent, but something that I would identify as common to that site and with the anonymous group is the upholding of the absence of structure as a virtue, because structure has failed. And so, therefore, what we need to do is allow for the process of self organization to run itself. But that's just abandoning civilization.
I can see how a decision not to have a leader and not to have a precise platform, tactically speaking, would be to Occupy's benefit if this decision was consciously undertaken and not just the byproduct of the reality that they're too fucked up to have a leader and too disorganized. But let's pretend that it's somewhat consciously undertaken. All of these groups are co-opted within no time by advanced political operatives who have experience and who know how these things always work. The Tea Party in the beginning was sort of a bunch of politically independent, Ron Paul leaning types who had a kind of very specific ideology. But the Tea Party phenomenon was co-opted by establishment Republicans and so-called social conservatives, and so lost any kind of force or meaning at that point, and now is understood by the general public to be just another collection of crazies, which itself reinforces the view the public is always fed, which is you're not capable of anything, you're not capable of an authentic uprising, you're always just going to be a bunch of idiots. Now, the Occupy movement, if it had a leader, a single leader, well, that leader can be discredited. Well, look what they do to Assange. Assange is out there. Assange actually is a bit of an asshole. And so it's all the easier for them to encourage or to take advantage of some pretty mild sexual assault allegations, report it always as rape, et cetera, and discredit that part of the movement. So, okay, maybe not having a leader is a good idea. Maybe not having a specific platform is a good idea, because then you'd have to have a war over what is in the platform and what isn't. And, it would be co-opted and taken over, and then people who are left out would feel discouraged, and the group would splinter. Then they would have some other group with a different name. Okay, fine. So maybe they think that they can just maintain the truth of their own will as the essence of the whole movement. Okay. But, what do you have in response? You have no forward momentum. You have the group as a whole being broadly ridiculed anyway. And stasis.
Well, I think it's worth dispelling the myth that there wasn't a commonality of intention there. I think part of the difficulty with Occupy is that for the mainstream media to discuss what was common in the interest and intentions of the people there would be to undermine their own interest. It's really fascinating to me that if you were to walk through there, you would find people agreeing on a large number of substantial theses, but they can't state that in the media, because in order to put forward that platform, they would have to give the lie to precisely that which they're trying to conceal. And so there's this excessive emphasis on the lack of agreement and on the disparity of the profusion of concerns, when in fact there's an overarching concern: the influence of money in politics, the fact that corporations are essentially pathological entities with this predisposition to maximize profit and market share at the expense of anything else, to externalize the human and environmental cost of their activities, and so on and so forth. The fact that the possible incompatibility of capitalism and democracy. I could go on at some length, and these and many other points are things that anybody there who wasn't a drug addict or an idiot funneled in by the NYPD would agree on.
I don't doubt that. I think it's true. But there is a distinction to be made between the internal considerations and the external considerations. Inside the group, I would imagine that there are strict Marxists who, for example, think that capitalism as a whole should be done away with, and there's no compromise in that viewpoint for them. And there are other people who simply, are in anguish because of the disappearance of the American dream, and they say that money shouldn't be abolished per se, but that it has too much influence, the politicians are corrupt, and so on. So that's internal. External, you're absolutely right. The news media can't really tell the basic truth about the Occupy movement, because doing so would involve saying things that must be absolutely repressed from the public discourse that they try to control and the space for which they try to occupy themselves. The news media tries to occupy the national discourse, and it's got an instinct for how to do that and how to control itself. You can't allow certain things to be said for fear that the ideas would get out and become more substantial. It's the same thing with 9/11. You know, these ideas cannot be really publicly aired. You can't have a news story that objectively examines so-called conspiracy theories about what happened on 9/11, because doing so would just, it would potentially cause a runaway effect. So we've got to forbid expressly at the outset all mention of anything that will threaten the mainstream that they're always feverishly working to maintain.
What startles me is the degree to which people have a difficult time understanding the message behind the Occupy movement. It reminds me of how one of the goals of English socialism in 1984 is to make anything outside the official doctrine literally incomprehensible to its citizens, because it simply cannot be stated within the scope of the official language. And it seems as though the the basic thrust of the concern of that movement is practically incomprehensible to the media pundits. It's not as though there is a self-conscious decision. Well, we collectively, as an institution, are not going to talk about income inequality and class conflict and the influence of the corporate sector on the direction of public policy. It's self-organizing, and it's self-organizing based on any number of fundamental variables. For example, advertising revenue. Global warming stories are fundamentally incompatible with getting advertising revenue from car companies, from oil companies, from coal and gas companies, or companies that own other companies that have an interest in these things, and so on. Talking about some of the detriments of the pharmaceutical industry, cuts out advertising revenue from those people. And so there are these self-selecting biases that feed themselves. And it's a fascinating thing to observe in practice.
Well, the media culture, the media industry, everything surrounding it is like a giant mind, and it's a mixture of conscious and unconscious processes, in my opinion. There are conscious decisions to cut someone's mic when he's saying something that's a little too provocative, or to jumble the signal at a certain point, to show things one way and not show other things another way. I mean, if you look at the coverage of Syria, the way the Western news media is constantly trying to push for some sort of atrocity story. They spent at least 2 weeks pushing a story that there was going to be an atrocity in the town of Aleppo. Well, what kind of sense does that make? How can you report a story on something that hasn't happened yet? And how can you say for sure there's going to be an atrocity? You look at BBC coverage, where all the time they do this. They show footage from some terrible disaster in Iraq 5 years ago, and they'll say, this is Syria last week. Or they'll edit together a montage of images, for example, claiming that the Syrian central government is using fighters to strafe ground forces. So then they'll show a shot of some guys on the ground, and then they'll show a totally disconnected shot of a fighter plane in the air flying over, and then they'll show a shot of something different. So they stitch it together. Now, you can't say that all of this is done unconsciously in the service of Anglo-American imperialism. No, they're doing it consciously. So there is an element of conscious calculation in all this stuff. But it's also true that we're talking about opposing worldviews. And when you've got opposing worldviews, sometimes there's an unconscious resistance that cannot be overcome. So they will, have a total incapacity to understand what could possibly be motivating the Occupy Wall Street people. Oh, what's the problem? So you've got that. Now, there's one other thing that I would add, and that is I think that any progressive movement like Occupy Wall Street, and this dates back all the way back to the days when you could actually be a Marxist in the U.S., as late as the 1930s, they're all doomed. They're doomed now because the national discourse in the U.S. and in other countries has finally shifted in such a way that any kind of genuinely progressive or Marxist, for example, perspective is now perceived to be itself a threat to the social contract. Now, I say before that it was possible to advocate Marxist views and even a strictly Marxist position without it producing the reaction or the perception that you were actually advocating destroying the social contract. There was a time when it was possible to be a Marxist, to advocate Marxist views, and for someone else to hear them and hear only a massive reworking of the social contract. Today in the United States, still, perhaps because of the conflict with the Soviet Union, perhaps because of the specter of total annihilation through atomic war, today all of these genuinely left-wing platforms are perceived now by the mainstream to be advocating the destruction of the social contract. So an idea like the redistribution of wealth is no longer now just like a mathematical fact or a mathematical proposal, economic proposal. It's understood as destroying the social contract. It means basically total anarchy in the minds of everyone now. So the center ground has been totally claimed by the right, and that too is a reason why people in the media and people in the mainstream can't understand Occupy Wall Street, because to the extent that that group has genuinely progressive ideals, all of that's now perceived as basically being equivalent with anarchy, no matter how you cut it. It's totally overthrowing the existing order, therefore it's ruled out, we can't understand it, it's not permissible, we cannot accommodate it in the national discourse.
Well, yeah, it can't. It's funny because what is the propaganda works not always in terms of what is said, but in terms of what is implicit. And it works not only in terms of what is implicit, but in terms of what is excluded and what are the parameters of the debate. What is the furthest right and the furthest left that you can speak without descending into the realm of the mad in the eyes of the general public and the media punditry. I'm not sure that the general public has any coherent view of what the detriments of any political platform actually are. It seems like the lowest common denominator is not even an articulate system of pros and cons, promises and threats, but simply catchwords that evoke associations. It's not operating at the level of rational discourse anymore. It's appealing to the lower parts of ourselves. It's speaking directly to, well, I mean, simultaneously, as there's this degradation of the information, there's a disintegration of the self. People have less autonomy, less critical thinking skills, less creative capacity. Education itself is geared toward placing you in a career, to making you a servant of a system. So people are less integrated, less autonomous, less creative, and intelligent as beings. And at the same time, the message has degraded. And so, instead of a coherent argument for or against a given platform, all they have are a set of free associations off of words like socialism, off of words like, you pick it.
Well, that's accurate on its own terms. I would say, though, that there is a discernible difference between instincts, instincts that the public may have here and there that are developed in their own way but well buried, and what you're referring to by associations, or like purely reflex driven emotional feelings surrounding buzzwords and so on. I think that while it's true that most people in the electorate don't have the capacity to reflect in any kind of real way, that they never reach that level of freedom where they can consider everything intellectually with as much freedom as possible, that they remain mired in sort of something which is denser and harder to move around in. I think there's still a kind of complexity even in that lower aspect. Today, a lot of people are totally reflex driven, just like the 2 Minutes Hate of 1984. They are Pavlovian political creatures. The buzzword, they've been programmed by the buzzwords, that's all true. But there are people who, even though they don't have intellectually developed ideas or the capacity to evaluate ideas in any free intellectual way, they have instincts that are more or less accurate compared to the facts that they've been presented. You could almost consider these as being sort of like intellectual ideas in disguise. There's some nuance to them, even if they can't be totally articulated. So when I say people have an instinct that leftist ideas today are a threat to the social contract, I'm referring to something that I wouldn't describe as being restricted simply to, people frothing at the mouth at hearing the word leftist. I'm referring to people who have some minimal capacity for reflection and who identify something discernible, discernibly wrong with these leftist views as they've been presented. And you've got that, I think, in different people at different times.
Well, I think we're seeing an effort on the part of the left to distance itself from Marx. I think that people who will accept the label of progressive have a broader, less formulaic, less dogmatic standpoint that isn't defined as much by potential solutions as it is by the recognition of a certain class of problems.
Well, I would disagree just by taking it from a different perspective. I don't think that there is any kind of political left in the United States anymore. Historically, the political left was decapitated in the 1960s with the assassination of JFK, the assassination of RFK, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X. All four of these assassinations, in my view, were state-sponsored, and it resulted in a decapitation. The heads of the movement were cut off, and as a result, in the political imagination of the public, left-leaning or progressive views were responsible for the social turbulence of the 60s, the social upheaval, and that upheaval was the cause of these assassinations, because remember, we're told in each case it's always some lone nut who did it, right? So it's really just world history, not, for example, the CIA or the FBI. So in people's minds, I mean, the left is discredited because it produced all of this suffering in the form of social turmoil. But in actual fact, the left was decapitated and has never found its footing since, in my view. And today, for example, you can watch a show like Democracy Now! On PBS with its, the predictable cast of characters, corresponding to the PBS left, right? You have your female lead anchor who is light on makeup, long on gray-white stringy hair, who you could easily find selling trinkets in some new age shop. You have the mandatory and token ethnic co-anchor, and the co-anchor changes out all the time. One night it'll be a Latino guy, the next it'll be some Indian girl. So that's guaranteed. And what stories do they report on? Well, some of them you might think run counter to the mainstream, but you never hear Democracy Now! Analyzing in depth what happened on 9/11 and what might be wrong with the official government story. You never have a Democracy Now! Revisiting the JFK assassination and the ample evidence that it was a state-sponsored coup. Now, someone like JFK has a somewhat ambiguous place in the tradition of the left, in part because revisionist historians have gone back and claimed Kennedy was a cold warrior, and this claim sounds like it makes sense to people who are fearful that Kennedy might be being romanticized and so on. So it has no bearing on what his actual politics were. But this so-called left that you see, PBS, NPR, the sort of like latte sipping left, is like an animal that's totally been defanged and declawed. As you say, there's no positive program for political change. They're no longer looking for solutions. They're interested more in, chewing over the problems. But in my view, that's the result of them being totally defeated. That's what happens when you're in defeat. You retreat to your cave and you contemplate what happened. And the left has been that way for 40 or 50 years in the U.S.
Well, I think there are two observations I would make. One is that the conspiratorial in general seems to have fallen into an unholy alliance or has been co-opted by the right. If you go to Above Top Secret or any similar place on the internet, you'll find a preponderance of right-wing ideology because there's a convenient similarity in the suspicion of the state, which fits nicely with the narrative of individuals acting under official sanction to carry out these nefarious acts. And so they can coexist in a way that is more difficult in the narrative on the other end of the political spectrum. It's an unspoken symbiosis, but it exists. The other thing I would suggest is that the right is equally defeated, albeit in different ways. The Republican Party has ceased to function as a political entity in any meaningful sense of the term. To call yourself the party of no and vote in a uniform block, defining your position simply as being against whatever a Democratic majority or a Democratic president happens to put forward, is to cease to be a meaningful entity that's pursuing anything that is constructive. But if you look at it this way, the people who's the right mobilizing? We've got Christian evangelicals. We've got people who are socially conservative but not religious. We've got people who want to protect their gun rights, and I think relatively few of them who have the core ideology of economic conservatism and things along those lines. It's a few people trying to mobilize a large number of people against their interest with a kind of pseudo narrative. Well, I'll fight abortion, I'll protect guns, but they're not talking about what they're really doing. So the right is defeated by a kind of deception and slavery, and the left is defeated by being dispirited and leaderless. So one has leaders, but they're virtually enslaved. Another has no leaders, but they have no direction.
Well, you can look at it from the flip side as well and say that the right and the Republican Party, far from being a non-entity now, while it's dysfunctional, has actually won the day. Because the fact is that when you elect an Obama who has the popularity of Jesus Christ when he came into office, when you elect an Obama who has all of the right cultural markers for being a bona fide progressive, from the university education to the ethnic identity to the style of expression, the whole package, right? He's one of us, quote unquote. When he goes in there and his policies are identical to those of George W. Bush, who's been vilified as being some sort of uber right-wing tyrannical despot, what should that tell you? It should tell you, number one, that policies that are not identical with the kind of broadly right-wing, corporatist, statist, imperialist hegemony, right? Ideas that are not compatible with that are impossible to put into effect. That's number one. Number two, of course, it's not even clear whether Obama himself holds those ideas, because he could have been an imposter from the start, a political chameleon. But assuming that he did hold those ideas, he failed spectacularly in putting any of them into effect. Number two, it should tell people on the political left that the enemy is not, the Republicans, but rather this whole hegemonic system that's in place, the pro-corporate, the pro-state, the pro-imperialist, and that it now transcends party, and even the Democrats have fully succumbed to it. I mean, we knew it already in the form of legislators, people like, the usual Harry Reid, the Nancy Pelosi, all of these types who are constantly putting through these reform packages that only benefit corporations and run counter to the interests of the people. Okay, we knew they were corporatists, we knew they were statists and so on. But now the fact that Barack Obama has completely become one ought to tell anyone on the authentic left, to the extent that it still lives, that the Democratic Party is hopeless. It's broken. So you've got a Republican Party which is broken, a Democratic Party which is broken, but you have an entrenched system that actually holds the field in the federal government, which is broadly right-wing and, has all of those problems. But, of course, you don't see this really in the minds of Democrats today. Democrats today in the U.S. will defend Obama at all costs. The fact that Obama made so many promises, clear, unmistakable promises that he then did not keep, close Guantanamo, bring all the troops home, all that stuff. These people will say, oh, but that's irrelevant because he increased grant money for student loans, so he kept the promise. And then they'll say, oh, but it doesn't matter because politicians don't keep their promises anyway. So the apologies are endless. They'll even tell you, somebody said in a forum, oh, well, if you're criticizing Obama this way, it doesn't matter what your political views actually are. You are functionally equivalent to being a Romney supporter. Your ideas are functionally equivalent to those of Romney. So if you go in there criticizing Obama as a statist, as an imperialist, it doesn't matter because by opposing Obama, you are functionally equivalent to a Romney Republican. I mean, so it makes no difference. Ideas no longer matter. Only identifications do. Ideas, forget about it.
I'm happen to be looking at a computer screen, and my eyes fall across a convenient illustration of the depth and the duplicity of the narrative that people are given. There's this woman that I know, and she's a Christian evangelical. I only associate her with her in view of the fact that she was a friend of my mother, and I'm too amused by her stupidity to delete her. It just offers too many opportunities for horrified laughter. And she has this quote up at this moment that's purportedly from Thomas Jefferson, probably is. A government big enough to give you everything you want is strong enough to take everything you have. And for me, that illustrates the extent to which people have been have succumbed to a narrative where the government is something other, whereas in principle, the government is ours, the government is us. So people concede the fact that the government does not belong to them. It is this alien force that takes your money. It is this alien force that could potentially become more tyrannical than it may already be and usurp your freedom. And that is one of the most subtle but insidious weapons against people's reclaiming their cultural autonomy. This vision of the government as other. Because that, while it may be other functionally, it may be other in terms of the individuals who populate the Congress and the State Department and the Justice Department and the CIA and the FBI and the NSA and who knows whatever else. They may be other, but in principle it's ours, and that's a fight that we should be willing to undertake. This concession, it's something that haunts American politics.
Well, it's an identification rather than an idea. If you believe in some sort of static, unchanging vision that, for example, government is evil by nature, government's always evil no matter what circumstances, or in other words, no matter what the reality, well, then all you've done is identify with a particular static vision, and it's the death of thinking. Thinking is something that takes place in motion. Identifications are fixed. So there are people who identify with the belief, with the vision of government being an eternally evil force. But then there are separately other people who superficially take the same position but arrive at it through thinking. They say, practically speaking, at the moment, government in the United States is almost a separate civilization. It's a culture that has sufficiently diverged from that of everybody else that its effects now are primarily harmful. But I agree with you. Yes, you're right. In principle, it need not be. But that in principle is understood by people who arrive at the conclusion through thought. It's not understood by people who make the static statement fixed and eternal and one of the axes of their coordinate system. But again, it's the distinction between people who are actually thinking and people who just identify with an image or set of images and then mouth beliefs accordingly.
The failure to think, the failure to act, the fact of the matter remains that it's easier to submit to various kinds of servitude. And it's especially easy under the auspices of the consumer corporate capitalist society in which we live. Because we have the illusion of freedom via the hedonic treadmill that we're running on. Because, and this is an idea that George Carlin put across in an interview, um, we have the illusion of freedom because we have a proliferation of meaningless choices. 300 different kinds of cat food, 400 different kinds of cereal, 600 television stations. The meaningless choices abound. The meaningful choices, well, we have two political parties, both of which have moved to the right, such that a Democrat, so-called, who still suffers accusations of socialism, is what we used to call a moderate centrist Republican. Two parties that are basically factions of the same party, the business party. So the meaningful choices are nil, with a pseudo appearance of two, and the meaningless choices abound, so that we feel we live in the land of the free, replete with opportunity. Um, it brings us back to Marx, in a way, because Marx felt that the uprising of the worker class was inevitable, because, in his words, people had nothing to lose but their chains. But now, these people believe they have a great deal to lose. They have their plasma TV to lose. They have their Hummer to lose. They have their shiny new iPad to lose. And so they are chained, not exclusively in an Orwellian way, but also in a way that recalls Brave New World, because they're chained by a kind of hedonic opiate.
Well, human beings have always gazed upon the rulers and the jewels and the baubles that adorn the rulers and wondered at this other mode of being that the rulers must possess. I think looking back at history, most of human history has been a clean division between rulers and slaves. And part of the untold story about how that relationship has always been sustained is that people with nothing look at the people who have these shiny baubles and who are, for example, carried around by other people, or who are able to bathe in a very rare and exotic bath water, or eat foods with a very rare spice reserved only for them. People who have nothing look upon that and suppose that there's a fundamentally different mode of being involved as a result of living that kind of life. And I really don't think that there's any division between that perception and the latter day idea that existed in Europe as recently as, Louis XIV, that the king was the representative of God. In other words, the king was the representative of divine authority, was a kind of instance of God. That was a crystallization, in a way, a coming to know itself of this age-old perception. And the perception is not one that is ill-founded, because if you look at it in terms of the broad meaning of human existence, particularly in the old days, when people would adopt a profession and then pursue that profession for life, it's always been understood, I would argue, that someone who lives a certain way, his being is affected. He now has a different being. So, for example, the doctor, the village doctor, is always treated in a way like he's a different kind of creature. The priest is treated like he's a different kind of creature. The being of the person is imprinted by living a particular kind of life for a long duration. And so we're really talking about something as fundamental as being in all of these cases. It's not wrong, therefore, for slaves or peasants to look upon other human beings who are wearing jewels and fine clothing and who are being carried around, or who being pulled by horse-drawn carriages and all that kind of stuff, as being a different kind of creature and believing that. And this belief, which is rooted in a kind of sense of what human being is, human destiny, human being, that belief ends up itself being an obstacle to what today we would call the ideal of equality. Now, today, two things are true that weren't true back then. Number one, there's much more fluidity when it comes to the path you pursue in life. Today, at least in the United States and probably other Western countries, a given person in a given lifetime will pursue several paths and therefore never become fixed into that particular mode of being that's recognizable by their peers. But secondly, with all of these plasma TVs and iPads and shoes designed with space age technology, the slaves are beginning to taste of that other mode of being, the royal mode, the divine mode of being. And so they, at a minimum, now perceive that their lives are different than what they were before. The problem is that they suppose incorrectly that their lives are now valuable as a result. So where they see difference, they suppose improvement exists. They own the iPads, they own the bullshit, but they are themselves simply slaves. I mean, it disgusts me now, understanding things this way and seeing where people live. Everyone lives in a hovel. I can't believe it. And I don't care if it's the most tastefully done little apartment with IKEA furniture. It's a hovel. The furniture is crap, even if it's tastefully selected crap. The technology is garbage. I mean, you hit the button on the TV screen, you get some sort of bullshit interface that wasn't designed with loving care, didn't work out all the kinks. It's just some eye candy designed quickly in the interest of expediency. It's garbage. So the magic of high technology, fuck it, it's bullshit. Everything in the fucking apartment is crap. Same thing with these houses. Houses are made of drywall, plywood, garbage materials, composite materials, plastics that suck. Everything is garbage. Everyone's living in these hovels, and everything in the hovel is made of crap or is garbage, but they think that they've now achieved that royal other mode of being because of this apparent magic of high technology, the glowing screens, being able to talk to your aunt or grandmother 1,000 miles away, and they're living like slaves. They understand, I think, that they work like slaves. They know now that when they go to work, it's a totally duplicitous act. They become a different kind of person. They try to ignore everything that happens at work. They bracket it. It's total cognitive dissonance. They do things at work that they themselves would never want to do, but they do it routinely. They screw other people over. They steal money from customers because that's what the corporation wants. So at work, they're assholes. They come home, though, and they content themselves for the fact that at work they are slaves by thinking that they have achieved some other kind of satisfaction, this other mode of being. But that illusion has to disappear before there's any chance for progressive change in these Western countries. They have to shed that illusion. Otherwise, they're never going to really think anything's wrong or take any risks to change it.
Well, what's stunning about our society is that we have the capacity to create meaningful change without placing our lives in danger. A person in Yemen or Saudi Arabia or El Salvador cannot stand up against their own government without endangering their life and the lives of their family. And yet we see in places like Bolivia, in places like Tunisia, in places like Egypt, people rising up in force against the oppressive regimes. Well, that were there and are there, to whatever extent they remain. We can exercise our capacity to shape society with relatively little risk to ourselves. As long as you're not funneling money to Al Qaeda, they're not going to come after you. As long as you're not at risk of physically disclosing the existence of alien technology, they're not going to come after you. You can oppose this system in complete safety. And yet, our resolve is defeated by this magical technology, by these shiny things that the visitors themselves warned against.
Well, I think that's true, but it's also not true. I think that today, increasingly, we see examples of the state gone mad and out of control, persecuting people over nonsense. I mean, all the way down to the level of the TSA, um, dumping breast milk and frisking old ladies and squeezing their little, catheter piss bags all over, and basically trying to make people understand that they're criminals and slaves. From the mass side of things down to the individual side of things. The case of the guy in the news 2 weeks ago who was an ex-Marine who came back, and his only crime was that on a private Facebook page he was advancing 9/11 conspiracy theories and quoting violent song lyrics. This guy ended up being institutionalized against his will when the federal government came to his house, grabbed him, and only because word started to get around and he gained the legal services of a kind of right-wing libertarian style activist group did he ultimately get released. But during the fiasco, the figure came out that in the Commonwealth of Virginia alone, something like 20,000 people had been involuntarily committed in I don't know, the past year or some very very recent time frame. That's not to say all of them are political prisoners, but probably that guy's not alone. So you have these cases where the state's clamping down on people and they are being punished for advocating just views.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are examples where somehow or another the machinations of repression are still exercised despite our nominal freedoms. Read an article a while back about a lady who had donated money to Palestinian refugees, right? And not not to Hamas, not to any political organization, to refugees, people who were on the verge of death. They just needed water and food and other basic essentials in order to subside in something remotely resembling a human life. And she was a reporter. She was an individual of considerable reputation. She wrote for high-profile magazines and newspapers, and I think she had a couple books under her belt. And she left the country to work in somewhere up north, like Iceland, Norway. It's neither here nor there. But she was on the official terrorist list, and so they could seize all of her bank accounts, uh, not only her domestic accounts within the U.S., but her money anywhere in the world, lest it be funneled into further terrorist activity. Now, that left her incapable of paying her rent. It left her incapable of returning to the United States. It left her incapable of, providing for herself in any basic way. That's lunatic. That's, criminal. And yet, it's another forgotten story, lost and, you know, completely unheard to the vast majority of us.